President Garfield was shot by an assassin just 4 months into his presidential term on July 2nd, 1881. Sadly, and largely due to the fact that medicine wasn't quite an exact science 135 years ago, eventually President Garfield died. The main reason was that the doctors couldn't agree on where the bullet was lodged in his body. They had no x-rays back then and no MRIs, and so they just had to guess at it. His personal physician, a Dr. Bliss, was certain the bullet was in one part of his body, but an expert who had been brought in, who had the name Dr. Weiss, thought the bullet was in another part of the body. They argued back and forth, Dr. Bliss and Dr. Weiss, and in the midst of this, and probably right in front of them, President Garfield expired. It proved later that Dr. Weiss had guessed correctly, and in response, the Washington newspaper wrote a now famous and ironic headline. It read like this: "Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise." Well, that's true when it comes to physical health, isn't it? It would be difficult to convince anyone in 2016 that ignorance would be bliss. It's no such thing. People go around quite often saying, "Boy, you know, I miss the good old days." I don't know if they really think about what they're saying when they say that. At least when it comes to medical care, the good old days were terrible. They weren't good at all. You could die of a toothache, and you'd go to the barber to get your tonsils out. Not me. Whenever I hear someone talk about the good old days, I think to myself, no thanks. I wouldn't be here at age 59 if medical science was where it was back in the good old days, and I know that's true for a lot of you. Ignorance is not bliss, except especially in the realm of medicine. What we don't know can hurt us. In fact, it can kill us. Recognizing this, the prophet Isaiah said to the people in words that Marilyn just read to us, "My people go into exile for want of knowledge." As a young man, Isaiah was influenced by the prophets of the northern kingdom, Amos and Hosea. They condemned the oppression of the poor, the miscarriage of justice, and also the selfishness of the rich of their day. Their craving after wealth was so bad that eventually the northern kingdom fell in 721 BC, and he thought that the same was going to happen to his southern kingdom of Judah. And so Isaiah was led to pronounce in our passage and further on 7 famous woe sayings. These begin in chapter 5. They're interrupted in chapter 6 with a brief biographical outline, and then they start up again in chapter 7. There's some difference of opinion about these woe sayings. Some claim that they're some kind of primitive incantation and prediction, and that they were called by the prophet down upon the heads of their people. May God bring woe upon you for what you are doing. However, the Hebrew word translated as woe simply is an exclamation. It means, alas, alas. In everyday usage, it would mean that It was used at the death of someone. Alas. In other words, the prophet is saying that the villains listed in the woes are as good as dead, and that their holy city, Jerusalem, is as destitute as a grave. He cried, "Alas, my people go into exile for want of knowledge." In other words, their ignorance was not bliss, it was destruction. What they don't know will come back and harm them, and it did, with a vengeance. Reading Isaiah's words reminded me of Jesus' own words. It seemed out of place, perhaps, to have Marilyn read them today, but they come from that night after he had come into the holy city on Palm Sunday, and Jesus then climbs back up the Mount of Olives, and he looks down upon the city, and he's not happy at all on Palm Sunday. As I said last Palm Sunday, he cried. And as he cried, he said, "If you, even you, O Jerusalem, had known the things in the day that make for peace." Reading these words, I remembered how on September 13th, 1993, President Begin and Yasser Arafat signed a peace accord while Bill Clinton was looking on the White House lawn. A peace accord. Well, hope springs eternal, but we're still far from peace 24 years later. Surely Jesus would still look down and weep, saying to his people, "If you, even you, had only known on this day the things that would bring peace." Lack of knowledge can hurt you. It can kill you. I don't believe the woe sayings of Isaiah were curses. Instead, I think they're cries of anguish for a prophet that deeply loved his people. We haven't time to deal with all the woes, but you can take the first one as a prime example. You might be surprised to see the kind of things that the prophets were interested in, not exactly the kind of things that most of the TV evangelists we run into these days were worried about. The first woe deals with land possession, a subject of enormous importance in ancient times and in modern day Israel too. Isaiah says, "Woe to those who join and add house to house, joining field to field." And the phrase referred to building projects where you just get a little more land, and then from that vantage point you get a little more land. Isaiah's phrase, adding field to field, refers to acquisition of land by wealthy religious leaders and greedy priests. Someone once asked John D. Rockefeller, "How much property is enough?" And Rockefeller answered, "Just a little bit more." It was that kind of philosophy that was adopted by the rich and famous in Isaiah's day. The prophet feared this greed. Maybe you remember the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings. It provides a telling illustration of the kind of development that was going on. King Ahab, you might recall, tried to get his neighbor's property, and when his neighbor wouldn't give it away, he had his neighbor killed on some trumped-up charge. The result of this behavior was that the rich of Isaiah's day, there was soon no more room for the common folk. It's no wonder, the early church listed greed as one of the 7 deadly sins. It is. Greed's right up near the top. It is easily one that leads to the death of our soul. Our forebears in the faith were wise, like I said, when they saw greed for what it is, it's a sin. We tend to some days baptize it in respectability and call it the American way. Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, told a story called Man and Dame Fortune. In it, the hero is told he can have all the land around him which he can furrow in a single day. And so the man started off with great vigor, and he was going to encompass only that which he could easily care for. But as the day progressed, greed got the better of him, and he kept plowing, and he kept plowing, and he kept plowing, until at the end of the day, he couldn't possibly, and that there was no possible way to return to his original point of departure. And so he struggled on, and finally he fell down dead and the victim of a heart attack, and he ended up with only the 18 square feet of land around him, in which he was promptly buried. I also thought about the story, the parable of Jesus about the man who had such an excellent year of his crops that he got so he couldn't store them anywhere. He was such a success to his neighbors, but God called him a fool, saying a man's life doesn't consist in the abundance of his possession, and it doesn't, believe me. He who dies with the most tools still dies, as a bumper sticker. He who dies with the most toys still dies, as the bumper sticker I saw once said. What will it profit a man if he gain the whole world but loses his soul? My friends, people are still going into exile and bondage every day, every moment, because they don't understand. They don't have the knowledge that makes for peace. Once again, on the eve of Jesus' Jerusalem entry on Palm Sunday, Jesus said, if you, even you, the holy city of God, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but no, of course, he would be in the grave just a week later. How desperately do our homes, our families need to hear it? How desperately do we need to hear the things that make for peace in America as things run rampant with gangs, mass murders, and crimes? How desperately do those in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Al-Qaeda, ISIS need to hear it? How desperately to those who starve in Africa across the globe need to hear it? And those who are bogged down by civil war across the world need to hear it? In fact, it seems to me that we've gotten beyond desperate in our world. Just turn on the nightly news. Our lives, our very children's lives, depend on a knowledge of the things that make for peace. When the Titanic struck the iceberg on the fateful night of April 14th, 1912, another ship, the Californian, was only 19 and a half miles away. The Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, was using Mr. Marconi's new invention, the telegraph, to try to warn the Titanic of imminent danger. But the Titanic's wireless operator, a man named Jack Phillips, was busy sending personal Marconigrams for passengers throughout the day to the relay station at Cape Race. Evans tapped out, "Say, old man, we're surrounded by icebergs. You ought to change your course." Phillips tapped back, shut up, I'm working Cape Race and I'm trying to send out some greetings to family." And so the warning never really got through, and we know the Titanic went down. Like the Titanic, what you don't know can hurt you. My people are carried into exile for want of knowledge, Isaiah said. On the ninth day of Av, in the year of 586 BC, Judah fell to the Babylonians. They can't say they weren't warned. Just as so, Jesus looked over Jerusalem and said, would that even today you knew the things that work for peace, make for peace, and of course still there is war and terror and fear in that same city of Jerusalem.